The great tendency is to mold God into the shape you want him to be, rather than in the reality that he already exists.
Dr. Tony Evans says we have the freedom to choose sin, but not to choose the consequences.
So when he releases his restraint, all hell can break loose, and he allows men to go their own way independently of him.
This is The Alternative with Dr. Tony Evans, author, speaker, senior pastor of Oak Cliff Bible Fellowship in Dallas, Texas, and president of the Urban Alternative. God gave us boundaries in life, but he also gave us the freedom to choose. So what happens when we abuse that freedom? That's what Dr. Evans will explore with us today. Let's join him.
Many years ago in Europe, one of the ways they would test someone to see whether they were insane in these European sanitariums was to put the person in a closet, turn the water on in the sink, let the sink overflow, and then give them a mop and tell them clean up the mess while the water was still running. They wanted to test to see whether the person had grown in their sanity. So they would go away for a couple of minutes and come back. If when they came back, the person was mopping and the water was still running with the stopper in the sink, they knew they were still crazy. Because they understood they did not have the capacity to get to the root of the problem. They were simply mopping up symptoms without dealing with the root cause, a stopped up sink with the water running. Today we're in a mess. We're in a mess. And all kind of mops are being used to clean up the mess. Whether it's our personal mess or our family mess or the mess all around us in our society, whether the mess is in school or church or wherever it is, it's just a mess. And great amount of time and energy, money, expense is being put out to mop up the mess. The problem is that the stopper is still in the sink and the water is still running. That is, we have not sufficiently gotten to the root. And if you don't get to the root, you'll be mopping for days. Because if the stopper is still in the sink and the water is still running, all the mopping in the world will not resolve your problem, no matter how expensive your mop is. So great efforts are being put into fixing the mess. In 2 Chronicles chapter 15, verses 3 to 6, I want to show you the root of the problem. I want to show you the root. Verse 3. For many days Israel was without the true God, and without a teaching priest, and without law. For many days Israel, the nation of God's people, was without the true God, without a teaching priest, and without law. So three things were missing on the national landscape. It says the true God was missing. It didn't say God was missing. It said the true God was missing. It didn't say religion was missing. It didn't say people stopped going to church, or in that context, the temple. It didn't say that they stopped saying their prayers. The true God was missing. So if they had religion but didn't have the true God, that meant they had false religion. Because the opposite of true is false. The great tendency is to mold God into the shape you want him to be, rather than in the reality in that he already exists. The true God, that is the God of the Bible, he was missing from the culture. The reason that the true God was missing is there was an absence of teaching priest. That is, priests who were giving God's perspective on the matters. So there was a third thing missing. No law. Chaos ruled. There was no standard by which society was operating. When there is no standard, people create their own. You decide, and so you hear people say, I know my truth. You know, it's what I think about it, because there is no standard by which things operate. So what was the result of a godless environment? How did this chaos manifest itself? Verse 5. In those times where there was no God, no teaching priest, and no law, there was no peace to him who went out or to him who came in. For many disturbances afflicted all the inhabitants of the lands. It was personal conflict, relational conflict. There's this environment of conflict, no peace. Peace has to do with calm. There was no calm, there was conflict. And conflict had become pervasive all over the land. Verse 6 says, nation was crushed by nation, city by city. So you got national and you got, we'll call it urban, city by city. You got a situation where oppression is taking place, crushed. You've got national conflict, international conflict, community-wide conflict. You just got a wholesale mess on your hands. That's what you got. But then we come to this pervasive statement. The end of verse 6. For God troubled them with every kind of distress. Now, you would have thought that it should have said, with all this havoc going on, the devil troubled them. I mean, with all this, our statement should be, it ain't nothing but the devil. But that's not what it says. It says, for God troubled them with every kind of distress. So here's the principle. If God is your problem, only God is your solution. See, if he's the one causing it or allowing it, okay? Now, let me explain how this works. The New Testament explains in Romans 1, verses 18 to the end of the chapter, he talks about the wrath of God, how God's wrath is expressed. And when he explains it 3 times in those verses from Romans 1, verse 18 and following, it says, and God gave them over. And God gave them over. But he explains that in the context of defining God's wrath. He says, the wrath of God is revealed, or that is expressed or made manifest. But the way it's made manifest, Romans 1 says, is by giving them over. To give them over means to release his restraint. To remove his restraint. And let them have their own way. Let them have what they insist on having. He removes the restraint. By the way, sidebar, when it comes to the last category about removing his restraint in Romans 1, he says that not only do they do evil, but he says they heartily approve of those who do. So in other words, whether they were doing the evil or not, they were voting for it, agreeing with it. It's been guesstimated that less than 2% of the American population is homosexual. But it's estimated that at least almost 60% approve of gay relationships, either as civil unions or as marriages. I told you some time ago, I was on the phone with I guess it was about 30, 40 preachers, teaching priests. The subject was the church's response to gay marriage. That was the subject that the preachers were talking about. And so I spoke first and gave a biblical defense for heterosexual marriage and explained biblically that marriage was given as an institution for creation, not just an institution for Christians. So marriage is not just a Christian institution. It is a creator's institution for mankind. Okay, so we went into that. And even I was shocked at the number of preachers who pole vaulted past the Bible to acquiesce to the culture. I mean, I was shocked at the number. Like God never said anything on this subject. Now, I'm not talking about being homophobic. I'm not talking about being unkind to people. But once you legislate its legitimacy, then what you do is you give God permission, not that God needs permission, but in the sense I'm using it, you give God permission to release his restraint. So he releases his restraint and he allows what you want to do. But here is the deal. You can decide the sin. What you can't decide are the consequences. So when he releases his restraint, all hell can break loose. Not because God is trying to make all hell break loose, but God can't be associated because of righteousness, verse 18 says of Romans 1. So he releases his restraint. Well, that's kind of the picture you see here. God troubled them with every kind of distress because he releases his restraint. And he allows men to go their own way independently of him. He didn't stop Adam from eating the fruit because of freedom. Men have freedom to a point. God is sovereign, but like a football field that has sidelines and goal lines, it has out of bound lines, it has boundaries. Those lines do not move. Those are permanent located lines. But on the field, there are a whole variety of plays you can call. So while the lines are sovereign, the plays are freedom. You can call any play you want, but you can't step on that line. Because if you do, the whistle's going to blow. You're out of bounds. So God has sovereign boundaries, but freedom within those boundaries. So you can call a bad play or you can call a good play. You can lose yardage, you can gain yardage, but it all will happen within the boundaries established.
But what happens when those lines disappear? Well, Dr. Evans will have more on that when he continues his message in just a moment. First, though, I want to tell you about his brand new book, just released to go along with our current sermon series. It's called Kingdom Citizen. Our country has always been a work in progress, but lately it seems like we're making too much progress in the wrong direction. But Dr. Evans says things can turn around, and it's up to the people of the church, people who are committed to God's kingdom agenda, to get the process started. In this book, he'll show you how to use the power God's given us to heal the divisions, reverse the decline, and overcome the despair that seemed to be a big part of life in our country recently. Change can start today, and it can start with you. Find out how by requesting a copy of Kingdom Citizen. We're making it available for a limited time as our thank you gift when you support Tony's ministry with a contribution of any amount. Just visit us at tonyevans.org to make the arrangements. Or call us at 1-800-800-3222, where staff members are standing by 24/7 to help you with resource requests. Again, that's 1-800-800-3222. Well, right now, let's get back to today's message. Here's Dr. Evans.
What you and I are witnessing is removal of divine restraint in our culture today. God is being summarily removed ever so consistently to the periphery of the culture. His name is still used with no content. So the people will talk about God, but not the true God. Because if it was the true God, they would be talking about God's standard, not just using his name. So the true God is being removed while religion is being maintained. But if you will watch carefully, there is a systematic attempt to restrain religion's influence in the culture. Be religious, just stay in church. My point is secularism, humanism is happening, and so God is removing himself, or is being removed from downtown to the outskirts of town. Like a flat tire. We want him there if there is an emergency. If something go flat. But if there's nothing going flat, then you just stay there till we call you. So that's our reality. That's what's happening. And things appear to be getting worse and worse. But yet we still have to live. We still have to live and raise children and function and work and do life. We still have to do life. So the question is, how do you function in a culture that is removing God from its center? That God, other than using the name, is no longer the dominating influence in the culture. How do you address that? Verse 7. But you. He told you what's happening wrong with the world. Now he said, now I want to talk to you. You, be strong. And do not lose courage. For there is a reward for your work. I know it doesn't look good. I know the headlines of USA Today doesn't look encouraging. I know the statistics aren't very promising. But for you, don't, he says, lose courage. Don't give up. Don't throw in the towel. Don't walk away. It's rough out here, up in here. But for you. You can't control what your neighbor does or does not do, but I'm talking about you. He says, but for you, do not lose courage, for there will be a reward for your work. In other words, in the midst of all this chaos, God hasn't forgotten your name. God hasn't forgotten who you are. As you recall, Israel has been judged. They're in Babylon. But Daniel made up in his mind. That's a but for you. Nobody was agreeing with Daniel. Very few people were there supporting Daniel. Daniel and his mini crew, they didn't have a lot of cultural support. But it says, but Daniel made up in his mind that he would not be contaminated by the culture. He wasn't going to let the culture contaminate him. Now, he wasn't some standoff person. He maximized his potential within the culture. He went to the school, graduated magna cum laude. Says he went to the school for 3 years, learned the language, all of that. He got the job, excelled in his career in a pagan land. But it said in verse 8 of Daniel chapter 1, but Daniel made up in his mind. And then we talked about verse 9 that started with now God. Now God. Even though the culture was declining, that is, he was in a secular environment. In fact, it's an environment he's going to be judged. Now let me tell you a little story about Daniel that you know, but I want to repeat it for you. The most famous story known about Daniel is what? Daniel in the lion's den. That's the most famous story about Daniel known. Daniel in the lion's den is in Daniel chapter 6. That's where he's in the lion's den. So he's a teenager in chapter 1. He's a youth. He's a teenager in chapter 1. In chapter 6, by the time you get to chapter 6, many years have passed, and he's approximately 85 years old. Okay? Babylon has been destroyed by the Medo-Persian Empire by the time you get to Daniel chapter 6. So you're dealing with a whole new culture, a whole new country, a whole new Babylon's gone, where we start with in Daniel chapter 1. And he's 85 years old. Now, why am I telling you that? Nebuchadnezzar is dead. Babylon is dead. And Daniel's still rolling. Daniel's still rolling. Because as for you, yeah, Babylon, you might be working in a non-Christian environment. Maybe you're the only Christian there. Maybe they're cussing like sailors and living like dogs, and that just may be your reality. You got to work. You got to earn a living. You say, but this is an ungodly place. But as for you, we're talking about you now. I know the environment, but as for you, you may be in school, and the students in college or wherever you happen to be going, they're operating on a different worldview. And it's lonely, and it's isolated, and it's maybe environmentally. But you gotta hone your skill. You gotta learn whatever it is you need to learn to do what you think you're supposed to do. So that's where you are. Maybe you can't afford a Ritzy school, community college. That's how you roll. But as for you, you got to make up in your mind. Because what God will not do is make up your mind for you. He will respond to a made up mind. He will not make up your mind. But when Daniel made up his mind, it was a spiritual issue, because he says that he would not defile himself. Because he knew that eating the food offered to idols meant submission to the idol. And see, because he understood the spiritual connection to the meal. It wasn't just about a meal, it was about submission to the God. Because he understood the spiritual implications, he made up in his mind. And then verse 9 says, now God gave him favor. Now God stepped in and gave him favor.
Dr. Evans will come back in a moment with a final word to encourage you as he wraps up today's message called When Your Problem is God. It's just one of 14 lessons in his current 2-volume teaching series, Turning a Nation to God. We'll be glad to explain how you can get a copy to review on your own or share with your church when you visit us at tonyevans.org. You'll also be able to sign up for Tony's free weekly email devotional, search through our huge collection of audio, video, and print resources, and get details on his brand new book, Kingdom Citizen. As I told you earlier, we're making it available as our gift when you help us keep Tony's teaching on this station by making a contribution of any size. Don't wait. Request it today before time runs out on this special offer. Just click your way to tonyevans.org or call our Resource Center at 1-800-800-3222, where staff members are standing by to help you. Again, that's 1-800-800-3222. You may be a good cook, but Dr. Evans says messing with God's recipe for living won't stir up anything but trouble. Find out why when you join us on Monday. Right now, though, he's back with these final comments.
So what I wanted to tell you is, in spite of what's happening around you, in spite of the fact that you're in the minority if you're a serious Christian, and when you are in the minority, it can be very troubling, because you become the wallflower. You've been put on the outskirts. So I just want to encourage you with verse 7. But as for you, do not be discouraged. The Lord will reward your work.
The Alternative with Dr. Tony Evans is brought to you by the Urban Alternative and is made possible by the generous contributions of listeners like you.